Hello, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Jini Glaros, and I am the owner of CannaCAS, a cannabis consulting and auditing company who is focused on working with cannabis regulators. Today's panel, as Zach mentioned, is titled Balancing Safety and Sustainability, Rethinking Cannabis Regulations for Pest Management and Remediation. And today I am joined by an amazing group of individuals who are extremely knowledgeable on this topic, and we're very excited to have some lively conversations about this topic that is quite a hot topic in the industry right now. So with that, let's go ahead and introduce our panelists before we dive into the conversation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you each of their names and where they're from, and then I'm going to give each of them 30 seconds to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves. So first up, we have Andrew Guy, a cannabis cultivation and operations expert with CCC Advisors. We have Dr. Jose Leme, professor and scientist at Southern Illinois University. We have Kyle Boyar, international cannabis field application scientist with Biorad, and Dr. Kimberly Gwinn, professor at the University of Tennessee. So we'll start with you, Dr. Gwinn, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself to us.
Hi, I'm Kim Gwinn. As she said, I'm from the University of Tennessee. I'm a plant pathologist by training. I look at natural products and how the natural products produced by plants affect the pathogens, and also how the natural products produced by pathogens affects plants and consumers of plants. I've also part of my work involves using agricultural byproducts or agricultural waste products as biopesticides so we can fully more utilize our agricultural products.
Kyle Boyar with Biorad Laboratories, and I've been working in cannabis testing for about 13 years now. Really just excited about all things cannabis science, analytical chemistry, microbiology, the neuroscience of it. And yeah, really excited to chat with you guys today about this hot topic that seems to be emerging in the field.
Hello, I'm Jose Leme. I'm assistant professor of cannabis biology and cultivation systems at Southern Illinois University. And I'm pretty much working with indoor production of plants with focus in cannabis, work with, biotic stress, secondary metabolites, and, all the good stuff about controlling environmental agriculture. I'm not really a plant pathologist per se, but, growing plants indoors, we are facing all these issues, and, I'm with all you guys to face all these challenges.
My name's Andrew Guy. I'm a cultivator by trade. I have worked for a couple of the largest cannabis companies in the United States. Been doing it for a long time, and I'm kind of here more on the real world side of things.
Thank you all so much. This is truly a powerhouse panel with a lot of insights to add today. So let's go ahead and get this conversation started. This is a fun topic to discuss, and it's definitely becoming more and more prevalent in the cannabis industry. Ultimately, if you're from a lab here, you're probably at this panel to better understand how remediation and pest management may impact your ability to test products. If you're a regulator, you may want to better understand what's being done to the products in your state. And if you're a cultivator or producer, you may be looking to see how you could use pest management or remediation in your grows. So let's start with remediation in general. And what exactly are we talking about? So Kyle, I'm going to kick off our conversation with you by having you explain why remediation is being used and telling everyone about some of the different remediation technologies that the industry is currently using.
Sure. So in cannabis testing and for legal product to go to market, we have different regulations across the United States. Some of these regulations are more stringent than others. Some are using total count tests, some are using pathogen-specific testing, and really, especially with some of these threshold tests, but also the pass-fail ones for pathogens, it's a bit challenging for people to pass sometimes. And so a lot of people are looking to different remediation technologies as sort of an insurance policy against failed product tests. Some of the different techniques that are being currently employed in the industry include things like irradiation, so X-ray or gamma irradiation. Some people are using UVC. Some people are using things like ozone or chlorine dioxide. And I think all of these different remediation technologies sort of have their own pros and cons. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions surrounding about how these things change the product itself. And in general, just some challenges that come along with it for the ride in terms of how we actually test these products, as Jini mentioned. So a lot of questions and not entirely a lot of clear answers just yet.
Does anyone else have anything to add when we talk about different remediation technologies? All right, so with that, Kim, as a professor conducting research on hemp and cannabis, what data, if any, do we have directly related to the use of remediation and how it may impact product quality and plant physiology?
Kind of as everything in cannabis, we need more data on this in this area. We have a lot of data from the industries and what they have done. And in general, as in most things in cannabis, we look at what is in the cannabinoids, what effect it has on the terpenes, and if that is considered successful if we have that. However, some of the things that we don't have any data on is I'm very concerned about other fungal metabolites that are in the products, and we know that those will not be affected by these technologies. So even though it is cleared of the biological entity, there may be chemical entities that are left behind. And then some of the products that Kyle mentioned, I have concerns about, are we seeing any residuals left of the technology on the product? And I don't think we have enough good data on all of that.
Yeah, I think good data is something that's very important in the industry, and with a lot of the different technologies that are on the market, a lot of the data that's coming is directly from those vendors or from those producers. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of transition to data that is being collected by third parties. And Kyle, I think you might have a little bit more insight into this.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it is great that some of these vendors are taking it upon themselves to conduct studies so that we can see if there are indeed changes in, say, cannabinoids and terpenes and how that kind of overall affects the end product. However, as Jini mentioned, we do need to kind of transition to more of a third-party mode of looking at this because, of course, when a vendor conducts a study, it's a conflict of interest. They have a narrative that they want to drive that, nothing's changing. There's no issue with the product. This is completely harmless. This is completely safe. But when you have a conflicting interest of you own the company and you're trying to paint a certain narrative, that sometimes can muddy the science on it. So again, I think that some of these companies are taking proactive steps. Of course, there's also issues with finding those collaborations with different universities and other third parties that could provide data that's not biased. Of course, this industry has no shortage of challenges when it comes to being able to study things on a more rigorous level like that. And again, I think we've also seen some things with some of these companies where, like I said, they are trying to paint a narrative. So they will sometimes cherry pick their data to sort of give the illusion or give the impression that nothing is happening. But when you look more closely at that data and how it's presented, it doesn't paint a picture of nothing is happening. For those of us who look more critically at these things, it's clear that they are trying to send a message in a certain way, but if you actually break it down, there's some questions that certainly come up. So I think, yeah, as we move on with this and try and figure out the best approach, it's going to be critical to have those third-party studies so that we can have an unbiased look at this.
Agreed, and I think that's where collaborations from events like this, CanMed, where you have cultivators, testing labs, vendors, everybody in one room, this is where we can start to have these conversations and figure out how to create these collaborations to move forward. So when we talk about remediation in the cannabis industry, a lot of times we're talking about fixing a problem after there's already a problem. So we're not being proactive. We're not using a kill step at the beginning to prevent contamination. We have contamination and now we're trying to solve the problem. So we're really being reactive instead of proactive. And so I want to turn to Andrew and talk a little bit about, when you hear how remediation is being utilized and how it may be impacting product quality, can you provide us with some insight into best practices that may be able to be implemented to help a facility get clean and stay clean? And then touch on how these processes can really support good cultivation and production practices in the industry.
Yeah, to your point, and what I always tell the cultivators is your facility has to start clean. If you have any issues in there, they're likely to be persistent. A lot of that starts just even in the build out of your facility, what kind of materials you use, the type of air conditioning systems, your irrigation system, all of it needs to be thought of in a holistic approach to keep any kind of molds, fungus, even pests at bay. A lot of that really and honestly starts with your team and good training for those folks. Sorry, I'm not really used to speaking in front of people. Really you gotta focus on your cultivation best practices, the types of plants that you use even. Your cultivars become a really big issue. As Jini was saying, a lot of those, the plants themselves can harbor a lot of pests, and some definitely do much better than others. So that's, yeah.
And I think with that, cultivators they're growing indoors, right? So it's a different set of monsters than growing outdoors. And
Yes.
It's a different type of cultivation practice. And so can we touch a little bit about some of these aspects of growing indoors potentially? Anyone on the panel about what happens when we grow indoors? We see a lot of these cultivation facilities that are actually even built in old facilities. They're not built up in new facilities. And so what needs to be done to ensure that that facility is clean from the beginning, or to get it clean before you start growing?
Yeah, Jini, you bring up a really good point about people kind of repurposing old buildings, like sick building syndrome. That's, you already have a problem with your infrastructure to start with. That's kind of setting yourself up for failure. So I think a lot of people who got into cannabis cultivation from some of these larger organizations who were not from cannabis previously thought to themselves, okay, well, let's just string up something, quickly, and this is going to be a walk in the park. This is just growing. How hard could it be? But what they don't realize is there are so many factors in producing a quality cannabis product, and even just the building, right? That's step one. And then there's other things as well, like, so how well ventilated is it? Are you changing your filters regularly? Are you employing the right preventatives? What is the history of that building? What was done in that building before? Are there other pesticides and things like that that might be left behind from whatever else might have happened there? Again, there's so many things to look at, and I think a lot of these things get overlooked, especially by people who have not been in this industry, prior. So I think that's part of it. Also, just in general, having good cleanliness practices, making sure that you sterilize surfaces, that you're not actively tracking in anything from the outside. These are all factors that are really important to consider in order to grow a clean and quality product, so you don't have to turn to these remediation technologies in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah, and also in that, you can't discount the scouting. You have to go in and scout your plants on a regular basis and make sure that nothing is starting, so you can control an epidemic very easily at the beginning. Once it's spread to a couple of hundred plants, it's out of control.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
100%.
So I think those are awesome, great points, and I think they're ones that the industry definitely needs to focus on, especially because there are so many unknowns surrounding remediation and the use of remediation. And so I think an important part of this topic really is that lack of research. So Dr. Jose, are you able to tell us about what sort of support regulators and academics need to conduct research that will allow the various techniques being utilized across the industry to be properly validated?
I mean, I guess this is a conversation that I have pretty much every week. Every time I meet with my boss, we are talking about that, like how we can improve research, how we can improve funds for academia. And I mean, raise your hand if you're working, if your appointment is 100% in academia, if you don't have any industry appointment. Yeah, I would say that is probably 20% of this room. So, and I think it's, you know, usually when you go to other conferences, it's a much more half and half or mixed audience. And I think we need to find ways to fix it. I think Kim can also talk about that. And as Kyle was mentioned about, you know, workforce and training people, and I think that's our job in academia. And I think the main point would be, you know, find ways to have a federal fund avenue, and with this illegal, federal illegal situation, it's been really hard to support, you know, academic programs, because in one side, you know, horticulture programs or, you know, plant biology programs, they're pretty happy with increase in enrollment for undergrads, but on the other side, you also have to support your grad programs. So, and it's like a, you know, very difficult challenge. So another thing I would say, I guess you guys, everybody knows that, but the cannabis industry is somehow secretive and hostile as well. So I don't see that in a tomato industry or, you know, specialty crops like industry. Everybody's much more open and cooperative, and so, and I have to be careful with what I'm saying because you guys are recording, but I have some I have some you know, local cannabis facilities in Southern Illinois that they're hiring a lot of my students, but when I ask them to visit it, you know, have a tour in their facilities, they're not open for that. So, you know, it's, you know, and I guess we are kind of creating that workforce, so why not be more open for collaboration? So I think, you know, these are, I would say that the two biggest challenge, you know, federal funds to support graduate, you know, level research, and, you know, kind of having more or less secretive or more cooperative industry, academia relationships.
I agree. I think openness to collaborate is something that we really need to move forward with in this industry in general. And over the last few years, we have seen more collaborations coming about, but it is something that needs to continue happening if we want to see a change in this industry and if we want to fully understand what's happening with the products that consumers are consuming. And I think that really brings us to a great next point, which is we've heard that there is all of these remediation technologies being used, but you know, what are our thoughts on whether or not consumers should be told if these remediation technologies are being used on this product? So, Kyle, I'm going to kick this off to you and let you answer it first, but I would be interested to see what everyone on the panel's personal thoughts are on this. You know, we're going to make sure that's known. These are everybody's personal thoughts and not the thoughts of anyone's organizations. But when it comes to remediation, should we be telling consumers if a product has been remediated? And if we are, how can we go about doing that effectively?
Right. So again, I think this comes down to a transparency thing, right? So remediation technologies, while they have been used in other industries, it is still very new in cannabis. So I think it's really important that we kind of take the approach of caution and not only include some kind of labeling, but you know, just making sure that people are aware that if they are consuming a product that has been remediated, that there's some sort of indication so that they can choose for themselves if they want to expose themselves to that risk. Because again, a lot of these technologies, from what I've seen, have been used to recover product that probably shouldn't have never made it to market in the first place. And so they're really being used to mask a bigger problem. And so that puts consumers in harm's way potentially. So one thing that has been mentioned as far as how to label is the use of the Redura symbol in the context of irradiation. There aren't any other labels that I know of currently that are being used for things like, say, ozone or chlorine dioxide. But I think it is important that the industry get on board with figuring out some sort of labeling schema and implement that. Because again, consumers have a right to know if they're consuming a product that was already heavily contaminated and has been recovered, because as Kimberly mentioned, these come with their own host of issues, especially if it was heavily contaminated. You've got things like mycotoxins, you've got things like endotoxin, you've got allergens. And again, there's a lot of just unknowns and questions that we don't have good answers to at this point. So it's better to be transparent up front so that consumers can make that choice for themselves, I think.
But I do think it's a very, very important technology, because if you are immunocompromised, you do not want to get any of the live organisms in your body. So I don't want this to come across from the panel that it's not an important technology, because I think they are. But yes, absolute transparency and labeling would be greatly beneficial. And boy, it would be nice to know that they failed the test in the first place.
And I think this also goes back to the academia, private sector collaboration, because where these metrics are coming from, where is the quality control metrics are coming from, and it's not even something that you can take from other plants, because usually for other horticulture plants, if the plant is not meeting the compliance metrics, we are just discarding it. So in order to make something reliable, we need to take reliable data. So and then we need to conduct research for that. So again, going back to that question.
I think one of the big things too that would really help the industry is standardizing testing and how you use remediation across all the states. And really, ultimately, I think that falls on the federal government to develop those testing standards, and then really legalize cannabis. It's here ultimately, and it's not going away as much as some people might like to see it.
So when you bring up testing, that brings us to another interesting point, which is labs testing remediated product. So I previously was at a lab, ran a lab, and this is a battle that I faced on a daily basis. Producers would send a sample. They would not tell us the sample had been remediated. We would process it one way, and then they would be upset by the results because they did not inform us that it was remediated. So if we're talking about consumers needing to know that products are remediated, what are our thoughts on cultivators working with laboratories and with their testing laboratories to have this open line of communication too about remediated products? Kyle, do you want to hit on that?
Sure. I think it's important to consider, right, depending on the remediation technology that's being employed, how that's going to affect the actual procedure of doing quality testing and getting the right answer and the answer that will actually keep consumers safe. So I'd like to give an example of this, right? So with things like X-ray, for example, you essentially have killed the pathogen, right? If you've done it correctly, if you're following the procedure correctly, and you've used the correct dosage, you should have killed the pathogen. However, a lot of the cannabis testing industry currently uses molecular techniques for things like pathogens, right? And so this is even outlined in a Department of Cannabis Control paper on this subject in 2022, where they basically figured out, okay, here's the ideal dose to inactivate aspergillus in cannabis flower. But they make a very specific claim in the discussion at the end that I think is really important. And that is, in order to actually test that it was successful, that decontamination was successful, you do need to plate to confirm. Because, right, if there's still dead cell DNA hanging out there, and again, this is X-ray, right? So those dead cells are still intact. There is no way for, say, an enzymatic solution to go in there and cleave that dead cell DNA because it's still encapsulated in a fungal cell. So ultimately, while cultivators are looking at this as an insurance policy technically you're still going to be pinging hot unless you do that plating to confirm that the pathogen itself has indeed been inactivated and it's no longer viable. And that's what's going to actually keep consumers safe. Otherwise, we're just creating a giant economic hardship on these cultivators and these testing labs that are now losing customers because they failed a product over something that probably didn't have a ton of safety concerns, especially if it's like, say, a later CQ of like 48 or 49. You've got a few dead cells there and we're failing product over it. And that's, again, causing just a tremendous amount of economic hardship and difficulties for these producers.
I think those are really good points to make when it comes to testing. And these are battles that testing labs are facing on a daily basis. If you're a testing lab in the room, I'm sure you have tested a product and had a client upset because the product failed and they said, oh, well, I used remediation on that, so I don't understand why it's failing. So these are conversations that we definitely need to be having and better understanding how this works. So with that, we've discussed remediation quite a bit, but we haven't really touched on beneficial microbes. And Kim, you hit on this earlier when you talked about the different beneficial microbes that are in the plant. So can you tell us some about those naturally occurring organisms that exist in the microbiome and how this may be impacting regulatory decisions regarding microbial contaminants?
Yes. One of the things that everyone forgets is that a plant is not simply the plant. It's a community. There is an entire microbiome that exists in and on the plant. And in some cases, these microorganisms colonize the plant to the benefit of the plant. They make just like our gut microbiome affects our digestion, the microbiome of the plant affects the ability of the plant to defend itself. Some microorganisms produce what we call systemic acquired resistance, and that actually stimulates the plant to put on its own defense mechanisms and in some case increase its secondary metabolism. So some of your terpene levels may be greatly affected by what microorganisms are in the plant. So when you start talking about all of the total microorganisms that are in or on a plant, sometimes when we're testing for the total yeast and mold content, you are testing things that are basically there that are not affecting humans at all, but are very beneficial for the plant. And indeed, and we'll talk a little bit later when we move into talking about different biopesticides, many of our biopesticides are actual live organisms that if a grower uses it, they can potentially fail the total yeast and mold content.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, right? So Kimberly mentioned total yeast and mold, total aerobic counts, things like that. So again, these thresholds, depending on what state you're in, they can range. Like for example, total yeast and mold I've seen as low as 1,000. I've seen upwards of 100,000. And if you are using a beneficial or something that's a preventative, say something like a trichoderma, which a lot of organic cultivators use because not only does it ward off the more harmful things like the aspergillus or the fusarium, these are things that are not exactly ideal, but when you use these beneficials to ward that off, you're essentially getting penalized for that. Because they will trigger these tests. And so I think it's important to consider that anyone who is using these beneficials are essentially going to have a harder time passing these tests, even though they're not presenting any potential danger to consumers that we know of. They're actually doing beneficial things for the plant. So something that we really do need to consider as far as testing regulations go in this sort of context is being able to allow the use of these beneficials so that we don't have to remediate again in the first place.
and also I'm seeing a lot of growers that they are actually scared about applying these beneficials or applying these biostimulants just because they're very afraid of not passing the test. And in order to make sure that okay you're passing the test or not, again we need research, we need to validate that. So.
And in other crops, we can do that. In other crops, we can treat seed and encourage that microbial colonization of the plant, show that it doesn't have any effect in the eventual product, but there is the microorganism still there. So it would fail in a cannabis test.
As much as I would like to use a lot of those products, I quit using them many years ago just for that exact reason. And I think in a lot of ways, it's at the detriment of the plant itself, unfortunately. And then to make sure that you don't have any kind of biological contamination, you switch to stuff that's more gonna kill anything on the plant, but that opens you up for bigger problems down the road because there's nothing to actually fight off some of those really bad pathogens that could potentially show up. So it's a catch-22. It really is.
Yeah, I think the way that potentially regulations have been written have created this predicament for growers, for cultivators, for vendors who are creating assays to test products, for people who are trying to create these different remediation technologies or biocontrols in general. And so, Jose, are you able to tell us a little bit about how the microbial regulations for those sort of contaminants in cannabis differ from regulations for other similar agricultural crops, and how these differences are leading to the use of remediation rather than biocontrol?
Yeah, I think that the lack of federal funds for research, the lack of federal grants are also leading the lack of federal regulation. And, this state by state type of regulations are, confusing. And, in my opinion, I think, of course, it's when you're talking about other horticulture products that you're not consuming by inhaling it. It's a different time of absorption. So talking about cannabis, it should be more restrict, but how much more restrict? So, and we are using some standards without much validation. And I think also in the cannabis industry, we should divide the products that are going to be inhaled and the products that are being consumed in different forms for different compliance control. And again, I always talk about this federal, regulation, and I think, having this, different states having different regulations is just make it more confused, and then it's much harder to control. And again, the only way that you can tackle that and fix it, it's being able to research, because again, what we're seeing for lettuce, what we're seeing for tomatoes is not the same for cannabis. So we need to have a more flexible way to at least research. I'm not, I would say maybe research, maybe having these universities and academic institutions having a more flexible way to test and conduct research would be the first step. And then after that, then you can create regulations based on that, and then the industry can follow it. So,
and as someone who is working with regulators and having these conversations, I think that regulators are in agreement that data is what they need in order to change regulations. And so everybody a lot of times wants to point fingers and be like, these regulations are too strict, but regulators had to get something out to protect the consumer and to make sure the consumer was safe. And so they created these regulations to do that. And so in order to change those regulations and move forward, we need to collect that data. And I think there is an opportunity for academic organizations to potentially even work with cannabis regulators. So cannabis regulatory agencies, more and more of them are adding their own reference lab. And so if academic organizations can partner together with those reference labs to perform some of these experiments, I think that that would be very beneficial for the industry to collect some of that data.
And also it works both ways. It's like, okay, we don't have data, let's be more restrict. Okay, as we don't really know what is going on, let's just be very restrict. Especially consider how often the agents are going to visit your facility. So comparing to other, horticulture products, it's not as often as cannabis. And it's like, okay, we don't really have data, or let's make sure that we're being restrict to avoid any potential issue.
So we all touched a little bit on biological controls earlier, but Kim, I'm going to come back to that because I want to talk about it a little bit more. So with the regulations that we see in cannabis and the restrictions that we're seeing, how are those potentially hindering the use of these biological controls in cannabis, and what are some of the benefits of using these controls?
Well, I think Andrew said it best. The growers aren't using them because of the potential of missing the tests. So some of the things that are probably necessary are to look for other things that are not biological organisms. But if you look at the EPA's list of biopesticides or pesticides that are legal on hemp, then you see that most of them still are these biological organisms. There's a few natural products, and that's what we're trying to do also, is look for some natural product and natural product formulations that will allow to protect against disease and insects, but not necessarily have the organisms that are producing them in there. But yes, if we could figure out a way. And I agree with Jose a lot that it is really important to know exactly what's going on. This is an industry that is totally unique in terms of how the product is consumed. Because the closest thing that we ever had was tobacco. And there was a lot of issues in the tobacco industry, as I'm sure you're aware. But But that was, so we don't really know, I think in some cases, what we don't know. So I think that, some rigorous study on these organisms and what effects they could have on different systems is also very important. So, like I said, it's very good for the plant to have these natural products and these natural antagonisms of plant pests and natural disease suppressing organisms. But at this point, it's really not something that we're able to use those live organisms in to the best of our abilities, because they don't pass the regulations. Now, I'm talking about this, but I don't know. What is the load of that trichoderma that's safe if someone smokes? What is that level of trichoderma that's safe if it's made into a gummy? These are the areas we don't truly understand, so it's hard to take a stance on how beneficial these can be whenever we're looking at an industry that still has these very basic biological questions that have to be addressed.
Yeah, something I would also add here from the testing side of things when it comes to these beneficials, right? It is kind of a shame that cultivators are heavily restricted in the ability to use these because of the issues with threshold tests and things like that. But these threshold tests, what they're really designed to be is they're indicator tests, right? These are indicator organisms of potentially something that could be worse. So I think because we've sort of applied this pass-fail criteria on things like total yeast and mold to a natural product, that makes it, again, not only challenging to use these things, but it's basically failing product that may not actually pose necessarily an issue. Yes, elevated total yeast and mold can be indicative of a bigger problem, but without actually taking that, I think what we really need to kind of do is maybe switch the perspective on this. Okay, you have an elevated level of total yeast and mold. Okay, well then let's speciate that further and figure out if this is actually, is there something harmful in here? Because again, otherwise we're just failing something for the sake of failing something without actually knowing that there's something harmful in there. Again, you take a calculated risk with that, right? Obviously you want to err on the side of caution, but simultaneously, I think taking that approach might be a better way to go about this if we want to ensure consumer safety without having too much economic hardship on the cultivators for these pass-fail criteria of these total count tests.
Right. Well, to your end point, the economic hardship of that increased testing is difficult, and a lot of times it's difficult to pass that cost off to the consumer. So it's troublesome, I think, And
just one more point. I think the cannabis growers they're very in a very particular situation because, again, comparing to other horticulture crops growers, if they don't want to be organic certified, they have other options to control pests and control disease. But the cannabis growers, they don't really have other options. So these beneficial microbes could really be an alternative to help them. So again, that's why you really need ways to allow the growers, and then the growers won't be afraid of not, passing the compliance test.
Yeah, it also puts them, it's between a rock and a hard place, right? Okay, well, I can't use beneficials, but I have to keep my levels down. What's my alternative? Myclobutanil, which again is also not a good thing to be using as well, and it's also something that will still pop you hot for a test. So, and then other people are starting to look towards other pesticides that aren't on the list, and that even creates a bigger problem, which I'm sure people like Josh and others in the crowd could speak to that we're seeing in other places. So, it's a challenge. It puts the people in a really difficult position because, you just got to pass, right? So
It's like I cannot use agrochemicals, I cannot use beneficial microbes, so what can I do? So
I think Kim makes a really good point about finding out with these beneficial microbes, what is a safe amount and how do we go about doing that? And how do we go about creating funding to do that type of research? And I think a lot of this is coming back to a lack of research, a lack of education, a lack of funding. And these are all conversations that need to be had. Sometimes they're difficult conversations to have, but they're important conversations because that's how we move the needle forward when we talk about the uncomfortable things and the uncomfortable position that labs, cultivators, producers, regulators, everyone is being put in with this because of the lack of knowledge and research that we have. So I think that this actually brings us to a really good talking point regarding integrated pest management. So Andrew, are you able to tell us a little bit about the use of integrated pest management programs and how they may be able to prevent the need for remediation? So let's talk about preventative rather than reactive.
Right. Well, ultimately, IPM, starts at the bottom with cultural practices, and really, at the end, your final two steps would be, spraying, applying plant protection products and pesticides, and then ultimately, in what we're talking about, remediation, through the use of a machine like a Rad Source or Willow or any of the other options that they have out there. But really, and for most people, it starts with cleanliness. It starts with cultural practices. It's making sure that your employees are knowledgeable about how to work in the rooms and what they do to prevent any kind of filth or problems in the room, and then making sure that they're cleaning up after themselves, doing that properly. A lot of times, even when you're in working with the plants, leaf pruning, bringing the plants in, at those points in times, you can do tests in the air, and you'll see that the amount of mold and fungus and bacteria skyrockets. And then when you're not working, and provided you've got the appropriate equipment to sanitize the air, those levels can go down to very low numbers. You're talking single or double digit CFUs in the air, where when you're working with the plants, it can go up into the tens or 20s of thousands. I think that the biggest thing for anyone when you're working in these facilities, or getting into a facility, is ultimately how you build it out, and then making sure that you've got the appropriate equipment in there that's going to allow you to keep clean. Picking good cultivars. If you've got cultivars that are prone to disease, even when they're really good, you either have to get them out of there or develop best practices around that are going to stop any of those pathogens from infecting your plant. And then finally, really have a good spray program and using the appropriate stuff, but not too much at the same time. You don't necessarily want to use these products through the life of the plant. Usually the first couple weeks, and then cutting it off is best.
And I think that's important for cultivators to have that knowledge of when to spray if they are going to use pest management, because the residual effects of using it too late in the cycle can also be detrimental.
Right. Once the flower really starts, you really need to stop so that, again, the end consumer is not getting any kind of oils or weird acids that may persist on the plants. Plus, it's not healthy for the plants. Ideally, if you didn't have to apply anything, your plants are going to do the very best.
So thank you so much for that. We are nearing our time for our Q&A, but before we do that, I want to pose one last question to everybody, and I think we've all kind of touched on this today, but with that, understanding the knowledge that we have so far regarding remediation, regarding pest management, biological controls, all of these things, how can we improve that? And how can we create standards or proper education for the industry to where we can move forward and to where we can have a better full picture understanding so that we all can make educated decisions regarding how this product and these different products should be used on cannabis?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So, I think that right now there aren't a lot of standards as far as how to use these remediation technologies as well, right? So there are certain bodies like ASTM that have worked on some of these standards, but again, the problem is you've got people who work for the actual remediation companies that are writing these standards, and we need more stakeholder input to actually get, I think, some consistency with that. And then, furthermore, when it comes to the use of these things, right? As far as having some sort of standardized protocol for actually how to use these. Again, some vendors have like an SOP written out for how these things should be used. But also I've heard from other vendors as well that it's sort of very kind of dial it in per your batch and dial in those parameters. So it's very flexible in that regard. So that also creates a lot of ambiguity. So if I ramp up the dosage or the concentration or the duration time of some of these things, that's going to create variability into your end product. So without some sort of consistency and some standardization, we sort of open ourselves up for a lot of ambiguity in terms of what the end product looks like. And so I think getting that in line will help us out with achieving some form of consistency and knowing what is actually going to produce a consistent end product in terms of product safety and quality.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that before we jump into our Q&A?
I wanted to add just a little bit because one of the things that I know from working with other crops, there's usually a body or bodies that speak for the industry. And when they're looking for funding, when they're looking for different things. And I am not, and I'm hoping to be actually educated on this, I'm not aware of who speaks for this industry. Or is it simply so many different industries that we don't have a single spokesperson or a single group? So I think that for me, that's an interesting idea because I know where to go for all the, who's going to speak for the soybean growers or the wheat growers, but I don't know who speaks for the cannabis growers.
Yeah, and you mentioned about education, and okay, we are talking about all this fancy and cool research that they can do in the future, but sometimes the growers, these master growers that are trying to hire the workforce for their facilities, they're very practical. They're like, we want someone with knowledge to do what we need to do, and then they have pretty much two options. They are, hiring the legacy growers that are, I'm saying the good candidate for these cannabis facilities, the legacy growers that are not really easy to train, and these students coming from, these horticulture plant science programs that they know how to grow tomatoes, they know how to grow lettuce in hydroponics, but they have no experience with cannabis. So, and how we fix it? Because these facilities, they need to fix this problem right now. They need to hire workforce. So, and then we talk about education and all this cool research, but sometimes they need like some very practical problems to be fixed right now. And workforce is one of these problems.
The workforce is key, and I've found that honestly, in cannabis, the more external knowledge of general horticulture that people have, it actually can kind of backfire on you. those individuals bring a lot of ideas to the program and aren't necessarily willing to work within the confines of what you're trying to accomplish, and it can make it very difficult, unfortunately. But training good people is key, and getting employees that stick around really is one of the biggest challenges.
How about the lettuce growers?
It's tough. It's tough. It really is. Yeah, I oftentimes shy away from hiring those people.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your insights today. I think we're going to turn it over to a quick Q&A session before we release from the panel.
First question over here.
Hi, guys. I want to say thank you. It's a wonderful panel. Thank you for sharing your insights. I think you guys were very transparent, and that's a key to success for this industry. My name is Willie McKinney Specialty Labs. The question I have, I've heard a lot, several times, even you guys, we need federal regulation. Well, I work in the nicotine space, and I've seen the impact of federal regulation. Now, let me focus on labs rather than the manufacturer. What are the labs doing to prepare for federal regulation? Are these labs 17025 certified, using GLP methods, doing proficiency tests, thinking about master files and validation of methods, et cetera, et cetera? Because with federal regulation, that requirement is coming.
Yeah, I think that, all the things you listed, a lot of these states are already doing. So, the states have sort of set the stage in preparation for federal regulations when they do come. Most states require some sort of ISO 17025 accreditation. Most states, not all, right? Again, some states are further along in regulation and lagging behind than others. But also the inclusion of things like rigorously validated methods through things like AOAC. Some states require AOAC, and I think that's a proper step in the right direction in order to get good results and good data. I think when it comes to federal regulations, also it's going to take some education of the federal regulators when they do come, because again, they're new to this, right? Many of us in this room have been doing, people like myself who have been doing it for 13 years, we know because we've been doing this for a long time. We've watched the progression. We've helped guide this and steered the ship towards proper practices and making sure that things are done correctly. But again, it's going to take education of these federal regulators so they know how to make the right choices when federal policy does come down. Without that education component, they're just kind of jumping into something and just sort of shooting from the hip without the background knowledge in order to make good informed decisions. So I think that education component for federal regulators is going to be critical to ensure the success of this thing.
And I'll jump in really quick and say, with this, I think that when Kyle hit on labs that are following those things, the ISO, the GLP, all of that stuff, those, I want to make it known that those are labs who are testing cannabis inside of a cannabis program. And we have a different monster that's the elephant in the room that is, THCA hemp flower that is being tested, and it's maybe not being tested to the same rigor that we are seeing these state programs require cannabis to be tested to. And that was through the loophole of the 2018 Farm Bill. And so that is something that needs to be recognized and remembered as well, is when we talk about that. And I think that's probably to the point you were getting at there with, are those labs meeting those standards? And that's definitely a question in the industry.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. So I specialize in sustainable agriculture. And I do a lot of cannabis agronomy and microbiology. And one of the things you guys had mentioned that using biocontrols is kind of a double-edged sword because those things could potentially show up on tests. You guys personally have a lot of experience with that because I use biocontrols all the time and so do my clients. And it's really about timing, application, and quantity. And we've never seen any failures using biocontrol products. So I think that narrative that that's a double-edged sword may actually prevent people from using these types of products, and these products are oftentimes much more efficient in both of the because all the different metabolites they're producing, and they also have multiple benefits, things like phytohormones that are being produced, acquired systemic resistance, and even things like cytokinins and stuff that are being produced. So I feel like with in my experience, that I'm not seeing any type of negative impact when it comes to the lab tests when these things are applied properly and in the proper durations as far as like time sets.
Can you tell me which products not the products themselves, but the organisms that you've used?
So I use Beauveria bassiana. I use Bacillus thuringiensis. I use Trichoderma T22 and a strain of Bacillus subtilis. And like in the example of Trichoderma and Bacillus subtilis, I have a current experiment going on where I did a control against leaf spot septoria. And so what we did is I had a control that wasn't applied, that biocontrol, it became totally infected, and then I did a post-infection application to actually treat it, and you can see it kind of grow out of those infections. And not only that, but again, a lot of these microorganisms, they work synergistically with the plant microbiome, and they're not just protecting against pathogens. Something like Trichoderma, they can work as a plant symbiote, as an endophyte, and create fungal networks that are also, liberating phosphorus and doing all these other things. So the benefits aren't just the biocontrol aspect. The real benefits are the synergistic, holistic benefits that you get from the associations in the interactions between soil microbiome and plant metabolites and pathways that they turn on, and genetic components of the plant that operate with these metabolites that they're producing.
Yes.
So are you talking about using those as sprays on the plant itself or root zone applications?
So both. In the
Yeah.
example of something like Trichoderma and Bacillus subtilis, they work synergistically together as well. In the soil, the bacillus will colonize the fungal filaments of the Trichoderma, and so they create a symbiotic relationship between each other and then also with the plant, but also protecting the plant phyllosphere and creating microbial communities that work also endophytically in the plant, can help prevent a lot of fungal pathogens, whether it's manipulating the signaling molecules that bypass the plant's defense systems or stuff like that.
Sure.
So also you're talking about your experience, but some growers, it's a lot of hearsay in the cannabis industry, and some growers are just afraid because they need to see something in the label like stating, oh, you can apply and you won't have any problems with your compliance test, or even sometimes you have consultants telling them you can apply, don't worry, it's going to be okay, but they still not letting or adopting the practice because they're just afraid.
Yep.
So and that's why you go back to research and having more clear information, the labels, the products labels.
And it'll also depend on your environment in your house, because the trichoderma will sporulate under certain circumstances, even though it's in the soil in the plant. Bavaria will also become an endophyte. That's some of the work that we've done in our group. But it will attack the plant if the plant is under particular types of stress. So I am very excited to hear you say what you've said, because it's the use of these things, if they can be done without losing the total mold and yeast, would be greatly beneficial, along with the use of parasitoids and that type of thing to characterize to kill the insect pests. But
I've built out complete SOPs for basically what's called biocrop steering, which is, timing. It's just like in agronomy where timing, application, and quantity is taken into consideration. We're using these microorganisms just like that, because again, really when we're talking about the microorganisms, we need to be looking at the secondary metabolites, because those are what's doing the biochemical work. And so,
Yes.
so I'm looking at, okay, does this produce sidiaphore so I can get iron uptake? Is it producing antimicrobial, antifungal compounds? And what are these compounds, and how much of them are they producing? It's really when you go into the science of the metabolites to understand how those are going to affect that whole system that you can really create the data that's needed. And so I've done a lot of this work already. So if you guys are interested, definitely talk to me afterwards.
Yeah, trichoderma is really kind of fun because it's got so many different modes of action. You've talked about it increases uptake. It also excludes. It produces antibiotic compounds. So yeah, it's a very beneficial, but it can also get out of control if you're not doing it exactly right.
Yeah.
I have just a quick follow-on question to this, which is fascinating. Are you in a state that has 100,000 TYM or intact? Because some states don't test for
10,000. I'm in Oklahoma.
Okay, all right, interesting.
Great panel discussion, guys. Really great. So philosophically, does developing remediation technologies give the grows a license to be sloppy? You know, I mean, and then the follow-up question is that do they just incorporate remediation into everything they produce? So even if they don't get contamination, they're just going to do this X-ray or ozonolysis. Does it really give the growers basically a license to be sloppy?
That's exactly, my concern with these things. I feel like a lot of, good cultivation practices and good post-harvest practices are sort of just being sidelined and ignored because they know ultimately at the end of the day, well, I'm just gonna throw it in my X-ray or gonna ozonate it and that's gonna resolve everything. But again, once you get sloppy with that and you're kind of just masking the bigger problem, then you have all these other things that come along for the ride. Yeah, sure, the organism's dead, but you still have all these other concerns, like I had mentioned earlier, the mycotoxins, the allergens, the endotoxin, all these things that are gonna have a net outcome of some sort of effect on the consumer. So, and then also I would add, right, with some of these technologies, there's still a lot of questions that have yet to be answered. And I think, being chemically intuitive here, like I'll give the example of some of these sulfur compounds, things that have been discovered by folks at like Abstracts Tech, where, these things are adding to quality. They are part of the aroma of cannabis. However, when you're using something like ozone, the argument that's been made is, well, it's concentration and duration. Well, if you have this concentration and duration that's enough to oxidize and kill microbes and destabilize the membranes, well then it's got to be doing other things to these compounds, especially some things like these sulfur compounds. Those are going to be the first to react, as Jeff pointed out at another conference recently. These are going to be the first things to react. So we talk about, it doesn't affect cannabis quality. Well, tell that to the skunk or gas notes that are no longer in my flower.
And just a quick point, comparing to other horticulture products, so the producers, they are more concerned about the good agricultural practice because they don't want to discard the products. But sometimes in the cannabis industry, it's like, I remediate anyway, so it doesn't really, sometimes they get a little sloppy about the good agricultural practice because they're, okay, I remediate anyway, so.
That's it.
Kimberly, do we have any evidence showing that trichoderma can actually colonize? I mean, we know that it's a root colonizer mainly, but can climb the whole plant tissue stem and infect the bud? Thank you.
I haven't isolated it from hemp because I've never done that test. But yes, in general, trichoderma can become an endophyte and go through the tissues. You might want to listen to Zamir Punja tomorrow. He may cover that. I don't know.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you guys for attending this panel. And if you have any additional questions for the panelists, I'm sure you will be able to find them around over the next few days. Thank you.